Good afternoon. Good afternoon. In the Old Testament, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced fire when defending religious freedom. Their friend Daniel confronted violence in a den of lions. Throughout history, brave men and women have dared to defend religious freedom and lead others in that defense. Today, we'll learn about one such man. We're grateful you have joined us for the Keston Spring Lecture, The Patriarch versus the Revolution, Defending Religious Freedom in Early Soviet Russia, and a reception and book signing for Scott Kenworthy that follows. I'm Jennifer Borderud, Director of the Armstrong Browning Library, standing in for Kathy Hillman, Director of the Keston Center, whose grandson Sawyer is playing in the high school state championship basketball game that starts in just a few minutes. So good luck to Sawyer and his team. For those who have never been there, the Keston Center for Religion, Politics, and Society is located on the 3rd floor of Carroll Library. With us today is Xenia Denon, a founder of Keston and chair of the Keston Council in the United Kingdom, who will share briefly about Keston College. Joining her from London is Council Vice Chair Tim Abraham, a retired British civil servant with significant experience in EU affairs. Following Xenia's remarks, Dr. Julie de Graffenried, Chair of the History Department, will introduce today's lecture. After Dr. Kenworthy speaks, Dr. Michael Long, Chair of Modern Languages and Cultures, will moderate the Q&A. Dean of Libraries, Jeffrey Archer, will close the lecture. Thank you, Jeffrey, for your support. Now, Xenia.
It's great to be at Baylor again. I come just once a year, and it's always such a happy experience. Keston in the UK was founded during the Cold War in 1969 by 4 people, by Canon Michael Bordeaux, Professor Leonard Shapiro, Professor Peter Redaway, and Sir John Lawrence, the UK's press attaché during the Second World War. The impetus for this was a request from Christians in the Soviet Union who'd been battered by an intense anti-religious campaign from 1959 to 1964. This request was made to Michael Bordeaux personally when he was in Moscow in 1964. They asked him to tell the West what was happening to them. Over 10,000 churches had been closed, more than half of those functioning before 1959. Many church members were being harassed by the authorities, and some were in prison. And this at a time when a thaw was underway, following the end of the Stalin period. Exciting new literary works were being published, like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn, and The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. But the Communist Party program adopted in 1961 promised that communism would be achieved in 20 years. According to the party ideology, Marxism-Leninism, there would be no room for religion in this brave new world. Thus, religion needed to be expunged from Soviet society, following the relative tolerance, though in a highly controlled form, of certain denominations, particularly the Russian Orthodox Church during the Second World War and after. While the Communist Party campaigned against religion, Soviet propaganda at the same time made out that there was freedom of conscience in the Soviet Union, that citizens could freely attend church and believe what they wanted. So where was the truth? Keston set out to find it. How did it try to do this? By gathering well-researched information, by basing its publications on documentation wherever possible, on published as well as unofficial sources. As a result, Keston built up over the years an enormous archive on religion in communist countries, which is now housed here at Baylor in the Keston Center for Religion, Politics and Society. So do visit the Keston Center. Thank you.
I am delighted to introduce you to today's speaker. Dr. Scott Kenworthy is professor of history at Miami University of Ohio, where he also teaches for the Havighurst Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Religious Studies programs. His research interests, as will become abundantly clear today, focus on the history and thought of Eastern Orthodoxy, particularly in modern Russia. His first book, The Heart of Russia, Trinity Sergius, Monasticism and Society After 1825, won the Brewer Prize from ASH, the American Society for Church History. And he has also published with Alexander Agajanian the well-received text, Understanding World Christianity, Russia. Dr. Kenworthy was a senior Fulbright scholar in Romania, where he taught in the faculties of Orthodox theology at 2 different universities over a year and a half. Yes. He's had fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Kennan Institute, the International Research and Exchanges Board, and the Social Science Research Council. This is like a who's who of like scholars in this field. Like these are all the places that you hope support your research. So this is a huge deal. He is the past president of the Association for the Study of Eastern Christian History and Culture. He's been a council member on the American Society of Church History, or of the American Society of Church History, and served for many years on the steering committee for the Eastern Orthodox Studies group of the AAR, the American Academy of Religion. So suffice it to say, Dr. Kenworthy is one of the premier scholars of Christian history as it relates to the region of the world that many of us in here are really, really interested in. And he is a tireless, enthusiastic participant in and a supporter of that scholarly community. Dr. Kenworthy's new book, The People's Patriarch, Tikhon Bellavin and the Orthodox Church in North America and Revolutionary Russia, is hot off the press from Oxford University Press. And I would say, I have in my notes that you can buy it after the talk, but you know what? The first run sold out. Okay, that's a big deal. Again, this is a big deal. The first run sold out, so we actually don't have it. We have other books of his that he will sign after this. And maybe you can visit him in Ohio and he'll sign the other one if you get that. But his new book is the basis of his talk today, which I know you are going to enjoy immensely. Please help me welcome Dr. Scott Kenworthy.
Thank you very much. And actually, why don't you can pass it around. You can at least take a look at it. Pass it around. Yeah, that's not something that usually happens to academics, that their books sell out. So it's exciting. And thank you to Julie and to Kathy and to everyone who has invited me. It's a real pleasure to be here today. It's my first time visiting Baylor. 10 days after the Bolsheviks seized power, and the Bolsheviks were the most radical of the political factions in Russia in 1917, and they seized power on October 25th, 1917. 10 days after that, Tikhon Bellavin was elected Patriarch, or head of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Bolsheviks proceeded to enact a program of complete social and political transformation of the country that included a program of militant atheism, which sought not only to dismantle the Orthodox Church, but ultimately to uproot religion altogether. Patriarch Tikhon, therefore, became the first religious leader to confront a modern totalitarian state in an effort to defend his faith. So in many ways, the clash between Patriarch Tikhon and the revolutionary Soviet state set the paradigm for all subsequent relations between communist regimes and religious bodies, which lies at the heart, of course, of the Keston Archive and the work of its center. And by the way, although the Keston Archive was founded later, after World War II, and therefore most of the materials that are located in the archive are from the later Soviet period. This morning I found many materials from this period, including from the KGB archive, the KGB file, an interrogation of Patriarch Tikhon from 1919 that I had never seen before. So there's a lot of rich material there. So although this story takes place earlier than most of what the Keston Center focuses on, knowing about Patriarch Tikhon provides the essential context for everything that follows. 2 months after the Bolsheviks seized power, Patriarch Tikhon issued an encyclical in which he provided an ecclesiastical judgment on those who are engaged in, let's call it random acts, uncontrolled acts of violence that was stirred up by the revolution, anathematizing them. And he also criticized Soviet policies that encroached upon the church. The Bolsheviks immediately concluded that he was irrevocably hostile to their new government and regarded him as a counter-revolutionary, and spent the next 5 years trying to find justification for doing away with him, leading to his arrest in May 1922 with the intent of trying and executing him. After a year of house arrest, the Patriarch was released, primarily because of international pressure that he should not be tried and executed. He issued a statement declaring that he was not an enemy of the Soviet regime. Frequently, historians have portrayed his trajectory as going from a staunch opposition to and open condemnation of the Soviet regime to a position of compromise and even accommodation. And I would say that most historians of religion in the Soviet period, and there's not enough, by the way, there's so much history still to be written, have tended to interpret the Orthodox Church and religious believers in this kind of binary fashion. On the one hand, you have courageous, defiant dissidents like Gleb Yakunin, Father Gleb Yakunin, that the fantastic book has just come out about. Or one is a collaborator, compromising and cooperating with the Soviet government. But my research on Patriarch Tikhon, which is based on exhaustive use of not only his own words, from public statements to private letters that he wrote to the Soviet government and other sources, interrogations including, but also recently declassified records of the Bolshevik party leadership, correspondence between Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky, as well as documents from organs of the Soviet government and the secret police, I argued that the story is in fact much more complicated and nuanced, and I hope you'll take away some of that today. So for a bit about the background on Patriarch Tikhon's life, he was born Vasily Bellavin on January 19th, 1865, in a very poor and remote village in northwestern Russia. His father was a parish priest, so in the Orthodox Church, the parish priests marry. Bishops don't, but parish priests do. After moving to the nearby town of Toropets at the age of 4, he would study in the school system that the church had established for the children of clergy. So all the way from a kind of elementary school level to the seminary, which was kind of the equivalent of the high school. And then after that, he went on to complete the theological education, which was the highest level of education in the Russian Empire for would-be clergy. And eventually he would become the rector of the seminary in Holm, or today it's Helm in the eastern part of Poland, but at that point was part of the Russian Empire, which was a religiously and ethnically mixed and therefore complex and politically sensitive part of the empire. So he spent most of the 1890s there. And in 1898, at the ripe age of 33, he was appointed bishop, the sole Orthodox bishop for the entirety of North America. So his diocese was the largest diocese in the world, spanned everything from Galveston, Texas to Alaska, and from, New England to California. And he traveled to all of those places tirelessly. And he was in North America for almost 9 years and did really important things for the Orthodox Church in North America, which I won't talk about today, but you can read about in the book. And I'm happy to answer questions if you're interested. He returned to Russia in 1907, where he served as the Archbishop of Yaroslavl, and then later was Archbishop of Vilna, or Vilnius, today, of course, the capital of Lithuania, but at the time also part of the Russian Empire, but again, a very ethnically and religiously diverse one that was also required sensitive handling, let's say diplomatic. So although his life before becoming patriarch is very interesting and important for understanding his response to the Soviet regime, I'm just going to focus on one point, which was his kind of political stance that he developed by 1917, before the revolution. So Russia was, in the decade or decades leading up to 1917, very politically and socially polarized, much like the United States today, which is, of course, why there was a revolution and a civil war. There was a great temptation and pressure even for church leaders to embrace far-right agendas of religious nationalism and ultra-conservative politics, in that case, monarchist and anti-democratic. There were some churchmen also, especially the lower clergy, who were attracted to political leftism because that was the leaning of much of their flock. But the pull to the right was stronger, especially for the church leadership. As Archbishop of Yaroslavl and Vilnius, Tikhon was pressured to embrace this position, but he resisted, always maintaining that the church should be above partisan politics, for two reasons. One, partisan politics by its very nature is divisive, and if the church aimed to represent or include all people, then taking one position over another would ally the church with part of the population, but alienate the other part. Second, even when a political faction claims to be defending the interests of the church, all politics is ultimately about power, and is more likely to use the language of faith for its own aims in seeking power, rather than seeking to further the gospel. And whenever the church allies itself with a particular political faction, it ends up embracing those political agendas, even when they don't line up with the gospel. This position that he developed before the revolution is important to understanding what happened after the Bolsheviks seized power, because his principles remained the same, even when a political faction that was inherently hostile to faith came to power. Patriarch Tikhon did not respond by embracing the opposite political position, that is, of the anti-communist white armies. Rather, he tried to stake out a position where he rendered moral judgment on Bolshevik actions without, however, supporting policies or political efforts to overthrow them. So as I said, he was elected in 1917 by the Church Council and immediately thrust into this position of defending the church from efforts to kind of strip away its position and its authority. And after the first efforts of the Bolsheviks against the church, he issued this statement in January 1918 that I mentioned, where he anathematized those committing acts of violence. But a few days later, he explained his position. This has been interpreted by the Soviets and even by many people within the church, as well as most historians since, of his kind of blanket condemnation of the Bolshevik revolution or the Bolshevik regime. But in a newspaper interview a few days later, he clarified that his proclamation was not intended to be political, but, quote, only moral. We are not summoning to rebellion against the government. The government can be monarchist or Republican, constitutional, Democrat, or Bolshevik, but it should not arouse with impunity such unparalleled upheavals and the disintegration of moral principles, end quote. The most important part of his encyclical, in which included the anathema, was to summon believers to express their support for the church, to send the message to the government that the people did not support their policies against the church. And the people responded in massive ways in Moscow, Petrograd, and other cities throughout the Soviet Russia in 1918 with massive religious processions, again, sort of demonstrating effectively their support for the church. And there are these pictures that are really quite extraordinary to see happening. Later, so for the remainder, for a period then, in 1918, the Bolsheviks seem to have gotten the message, you could say, and backed off from the more direct confrontation with the church. But then in the latter half of 1918, as the Civil War was intensifying, they took a harder line and began, first of all, attacking the church by confiscating its property. So the law on separation of church and state declared that the church, which actually ceased to exist in the eyes of the law entirely, the law did not recognize the church as such, and moreover declared that all of the property that had belonged to the church, including ordinary church buildings and their contents, no longer belonged to the church. They called it public property. And so if believers wanted to use their churches, they had to form groups of like 20 people who would then sign a contract with local government authorities to be able to use their churches. So in effect, the Soviet approach was to decapitate the church, to sever it, the kind of church administration's ability to govern it as a whole, and fragment it by giving all of the power to the people. And they hoped that this would eventually sort of dissipate religion altogether, especially combined with anti-religious propaganda. The Soviets saw the institutional church and its leadership as a political threat and tried to crush it. But as yet, it had too weak a hold on power to risk alienating the common people by assaulting religion at the grassroots level. That would come later, especially under Stalin in the 1930s. Patriarch Tikhon and the Church Council, while criticizing what the measures of the law, nevertheless embraced this notion that the laity would take over their churches for themselves and encouraged them to take responsibility for their churches, as well as to unite in broader groups of believers through brotherhoods and sisterhoods or unions of parish councils in cities and things like this, to be ready to defend the church. The Patriarch even referred to his experience in America, where the churches depended so much upon the support of lay believers, right? The sort of congregationalist spirit in the United States. He said, we can actually follow this path and embrace this in Russia now. And this, in effect, saved the church, because had they taken a position of not encouraging ordinary people to take over responsibility for their churches, the Soviets might have closed churches on a mass scale, which, again, they would do later in the 1930s, but not yet. For the rest of the 1920s, there's almost a kind of revival of religion, because people are more enthusiastic about it than ever because it's theirs now in a way that it had never been before. The Orthodox Church, of course, is very hierarchical under normal circumstances, and so the bishops make all the decisions and the priests follow, and the lay people are sort of just supposed to be silent. So this was a kind of revolution within the church where the Patriarch was empowering the people to become active in their parishes and in the defense of the church, even if whatever persecution happens to the bishops and the priests and so on. So that's why I entitled the book The People's Patriarch. In the late summer and fall of 1918 brought an intensification of the Civil War, and in response to an attempt on Lenin's life, they instituted the Red Terror, which was summary justice meted out on those even suspected of aligning themselves or supporting opposition forces. So in October 1918, Patriarch Tikhon wrote a letter to the Bolshevik leadership on the first anniversary of their assumption of power, in which he criticized them for breaking a series of promises they had made to the Russian people. They had promised freedom and justice, but ruthlessly repressed critics and violated human rights. And they promised peace by withdrawing Russia from World War I, but instead of bringing peace, they had stoked civil war, and so on. And he said at the end of this, I know you will just take this as me being counter-revolutionary and may arrest me as a result, but what I'm asking for is that you change your attitudes to start, to stop kind of suppressing human rights, violating human rights, and so on. And of course, they did arrest him in November 1918. And he sent out another letter where he defended his position by drawing a sharp distinction between criticizing the government, which he claimed he had the right to do, and opposing it or calling for its overthrow, which he asserted he did not condone. The government never brought any formal charges against him because they didn't really have anything, and released him, this time, in January 1919. In the height of the Civil War in 1919, Patriarch Tikhon issued only 2 statements, both of which were kind of circular epistles addressed to the flock rather than to the government. The first called upon Christians not to engage in reprisals against their opponents in the Civil War, which both sides were doing with increasing violence and brutality. So this was effectively directed both at the Reds and the Whites, and also for either side to refrain from engaging in pogroms, because the Jews were frequently victims of this, caught in between the Reds and the Whites during the Civil War. So he condemned very explicitly the pogroms that were being committed. And the second encyclical he issued in October 1919, which was at a critical moment of the Civil War, called on clergy not to take sides in the conflict. He forcefully condemned the Civil War as an internecine strife of Russians pitted against Russians, rather than an ideological conflict between Reds and Whites, sort of the good guys and the bad guys. So he positioned the conflict as this, internal conflict rather than as one of good versus evil, and condemned the violence committed by all sides. The Patriarch himself had attempted from the beginning to discriminate between criticizing the regime's actions, especially as it was attacks upon the church and violations of human rights and religious freedom more broadly, but at the same time asserting that his statements were not intended to be counter-revolutionary. He was not opposing the regime per se, but rather specific actions that in principle they could stop or correct. He used the democratic language of 1917 to make this case. The people, not the church, should determine the form of the government, but he saw it as his prerogative as Patriarch to condemn brutality, injustice, and the violation of human rights. He was arrested for a second time in December 1919. This time, he would remain under house arrest for over a year. The Patriarch's criticisms from the previous year had stung hard to the Bolshevik leadership, and they had sought for over a year to find some incriminating evidence to be able to accuse him of counter-revolution, but never really were able to. But nevertheless, they arrested him and were trying hard to find something to throw at him as also a way of kind of undermining his influence. And while he was under arrest in 1919, he was interrogated by Martin Latzis, who was one of the most infamous Cheka agents, secret police agents at the time. And they had such an interesting dialogue. So Latzis was trying to get Patriarch Tikhon to retract his criticisms from that first anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and Tikhon refused to. For the Cheka, that is for the Soviets, any criticism was tantamount to counter-revolution, whereas the Patriarch asserted in his interrogation that criticizing specific policies or actions of the government was not the same thing as calling for its overthrow. Again, appealed to the language of democracy. His political views were his own personal business, which he would reveal, he said, in the ballot box, and that was true for everyone. Everyone had the right to their political convictions, but he would never violate anyone's conscience by telling them how to vote or imposing his political opinion on them. So he would not use his position as church leader to try to sway people's political actions. Of course, such comments were implicit criticisms of the Bolsheviks, because by that point, there were really no free elections anymore. But nevertheless, this was the way he approached it. And when asked by Latzis whether he would ever change his relationship to the Soviet government, he replied very forthrightly that he would change his position towards the Soviet government when the Soviet government changed its relationship to the church. One of the other things the Soviets did during the Civil War was trying to attack elements of the faith that would simultaneously erode people's belief, but also sought to kind of expose the clergy as somehow having manipulated the people and deceived them and so on. So this included an attack on saints' relics and whatnot. And so he wrote a series of letters. These were private letters, so they only came to light fairly recently, in which he sought to defend the church and the faith against the actions of the Soviet government by making an appeal to Soviet law to demonstrate that these campaigns, for example, the one against relics and saints, the cult of the saints, was in fact violating the Soviets' own laws, constitution, and stated principles. The letter stated that both the Constitution and the decree of separation of church and state guaranteed freedom of conscience, including the freedom of religious propaganda, which was in the first Constitution in 1918, as well as the freedom of religious practice and ritual. Quoting Soviet resolutions and statements by Lenin, the Patriarch asserted that the Soviet government was in fact violating its own laws, which guaranteed freedom of fulfillment of religious rights. So these campaigns were illegitimate and amounted to religious persecution, which by the 20th century, he asserted, based upon historical examples from Roman emperors to the Inquisition, the Patriarch asserted that it was obvious to everyone that religious persecution never succeeded in coercing anyone to change their ideas. If the government had a say in internal matters in the imperial Russia when church and state were united, that was one thing. But now, because of the decree of separation of church and state, the Soviet government should not be doing taking actions that were actually interfering in the internal life of the church and its practices. Patriarch Tikhon's letters, therefore, treated Soviet law as actually granting freedom in principle to believers. But the problem was their own implementation of them. And he wrote a second letter to Kalinin later in 1921, where he built on these arguments. And he began with a historical example, again, with the Roman persecution. And that the Romans had claimed they were persecuting Christianity because it was superstition and because supposedly it was opposed by the people. Christianity was opposed by the people, so the Roman authorities were justified their attacks on Christianity by saying this is what the people wanted, which was the same language that the Bolsheviks were using. Supposedly this was done for the people and because they were combating superstition. And that these two principles were kind of what all persecutors, I should say, had appealed to subsequently. So whenever persecutors, quote, threw the entire weight of state power at believers, end quote, the first Christians and later believers and even non-believers, quote, opposed fire and iron with the principle of free conscience and toleration for religious convictions. The Edict of Milan, the Reformation, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man are colossal monuments to the victory of the human spirit over the coercion of the human person, end quote. By persecuting religion on the basis that it was superstitious, the Soviet government was abandoning the path of progress and, in fact, returning to obsolete, antiquated practices of religious persecution. And this was meant to kind of sting them because the Bolsheviks like to think of themselves as progressive and moving forward, and they were combating things that were, holding people back, right? So it was kind of flipping it on their head. And he asserted that Orthodox believers were ready to obey the government. St. Paul had taught Christians to submit even to the Roman government, but only as long as obeying the state did not go against the faith. The Patriarch argued that the Soviets were pushing Orthodox believers into opposing the government because of its anti-religious policies that contradicted their own declared principles, that is, the government's declared principles. He therefore asked the Soviet government, quote, observe your own laws laid out in the Constitution on religious tolerance and the freedom of conscience. And remember that we live in the 20th century, not in the dark period of the Middle Ages, and thus it is necessary to leave behind any compulsion in matters of faith. Do not overstep the lines of what is forbidden for a Christian. Do not make persecutors of yourselves and do not make martyrs of us, end quote. So these arguments he made, well, it's hard to say exactly. At the time, they seemed to fall on deaf ears, especially as long as Lenin was alive. Lenin always took the hard line on religion. And this erupted especially in this campaign to confiscate church valuables, ostensibly for famine relief in 1922, but in fact, we now know from the documents that have been released that it was for basically because the government was broke. And Patriarch Tikhon issued a statement. He had tried to cooperate before they issued this decree that they were simply going to seize the valuables. He tried to say, we will assist, we will help out. In fact, in 1921, he issued an international appeal that the American Relief Administration had responded to and others had responded to. But then when they finally passed this decree that they were just going to confiscate the valuables, he issued a statement that while they were willing to hand over some valuables, things that were used sacramentally, that is, Eucharistic chalices and things like that, to hand those over was blasphemy. And there were clashes between Soviet agents who'd come in to take over churches and believers who were trying to defend their churches from them being ransacked. And as a consequence of this, they finally felt like they had him, that they had something that they could accuse him of opposition to the government. He was arrested. He spent over a year under house arrest in the Donskoy Monastery, but confined to 2 rooms for over a year, where the only people he interacted with was a Red Army soldier and a Czech agent. And as I said, the whole plan was to concoct this show trial. It was going to be a public show trial that was going to culminate in his execution. But as I said, thanks to international pressure, especially British pressure, both the Archbishop of Canterbury issued a very strong statement, and then even the foreign minister, British foreign minister Curzon, issued a statement that basically, if they executed the Patriarch, this would result in a rupture of trade relations between the Soviets. So they looked for an off-ramp and were able to get Patriarch Tikhon to issue this statement where he was not an enemy of the Soviet government, which was in fact not saying anything new. He'd been saying that all along, but it satisfied them. And he spends the last 2 years of his life effectively trying to figure out how to normalize relationship between the Soviet government and the church and religion. And he'd hoped that they would legalize it and tolerate it. And it seemed there was a brief window in like 1924 after Lenin's death where that seemed possible. So one may wonder, he was advocating a position. His conviction was that the root of Russia's ills were spiritual and moral, and so therefore the solutions had to be spiritual ones, not political ones. And in his sermons, he was, even when he was like, priests were getting killed and he himself was being arrested and interrogated and things like this, his message was always, we have to look at ourselves and see where our own faults lie, and through repentance come to love even those who are our opponents and our enemies, right? And hoped for and advocated for some kind of reconciliation. That was his end goal. It was not really to be in the Soviet period, right? Since the force of the government, you could say in the time, triumphed over religion. But one may say that that position in the end won out as the Soviet regime finally disintegrated, and faith remains. His funeral in April 1925 was attended by massive numbers of people. One foreign diplomat said there was even more people at Patriarch Tikhon's funeral than were at Lenin's funeral. And he was canonized a saint in the Orthodox Church. by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1989, so right before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as Julie already mentioned, we can't do this kind of research without the support of all of these institutions, many of which unfortunately are under threat right now, but that makes this kind of work possible. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you. So that's a good question. No, they were not. Basically, they were not returned. Many of them were sold to the West, and some others were melted down. The plan was basically to, melt the gold and silver and sell it. There were bells that ended up at Harvard, right, and that got returned at the end of the Soviet period. And there were things like some of the, saints' relics and stuff like that that were housed in museums and other places that were returned after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But most of this stuff was gone. I mean, in some churches, things that had been accumulated for centuries were just gone, right? It's like history, it will never come back, yeah. Just wait for the microphone so that you can be, oops.
So we'll get you first, and then you can pass it down.
So I was just wondering, Tikhon, of course, spent time in America, and as he struggled with the state versus the church, how do you think his Orthodox view influenced that? Because we see in Catholicism really the emphasis on church and state together often, and then the West has really moved to Protestantism, and then with that, more distinct branches of sorts. How do you think Tikhon, with Orthodoxy, view that relationship after having spent time in America and everything?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So he, to some degree, I have to guess because he never speaks about it explicitly. But it seemed like when he returned to Russia after being in America, he still followed the assumption that church and state would be, you'd still have an established church in Russia, and that they would remain tied. That never really been, that was something that was never really questioned in Orthodox history. But I think after the revolution, he may be thinking back on his experience in North America and understanding what separation of church and state could look like and should look like, and then seeing what the Soviets were claiming was separation of church and state, which was in fact not. It was the state's assault on religion. There he begins to develop much more clear ideas of how the church really is better off being independent from the state because it's freer. In 1917, a lot of people were already kind of saying the church needs to be free from the state because as long as it had been so tied to the imperial state, and even in 19th century and early 20th century Russia, that had actually hampered the church from being able to, carry out its mission, you can say. Yeah.
That last message was super important that you just said. I'm going to make a statement. I have a question after that. The idea that activism is actually personal transformation first is very, very amazing and super important for today. But my question is, his life overlapped with Romanov's a lot. Can you speak to that overlap? Was there any letters or any dialogue between them? And that was during their incarceration and so on?
So he met Tsar Nicholas II on 3 or 4 occasions only. I know that he met with the Tsar before he went to America. I think maybe not before his first trip, but he'd come back to Russia in 1903, and then before he returned back to America again, I think he met with the Tsar. There was when they were celebrating the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty in 1913. the royal family was kind of making this pilgrimage where they stopped in Yaroslavl, where he was the archbishop, and he sort of spent a couple days with them and showed them around and things like this. There's a picture in the book, actually, of him walking side by side with Nicholas II. And on that visit, the only expression later afterwards was to, a sort of confidant where he seemed relieved the visit was over, right? Because you can imagine a lot of pressure receiving the Tsar, whom he did not seem to have a personal relationship with. And then in 1914, or 1915, I guess, at some point during the war. So I would not say they had a kind of close relationship in any way, but after Nicholas II was executed, he gave a sermon in the Kazan Cathedral in Moscow, which is on Red Square, like across the yard from the Kremlin, where he condemned the execution of Nicholas II in no uncertain terms, right? Incredibly bold thing for him to be doing at that point, as an unjust act, just sort of no trial, no legal procedure, just, these people just decide to kill him, kind of thing.
Was he in touch with the late 19th century religious philosophical society? Because when you talked about his understanding of the political and social problems having spiritual, moral roots, this was so much part of the thinking of Simeon Frank, for example, who analysed 19th century history in those terms. Did he have any contact after coming back from America?
Not that I know of, not any direct personal contact. One of the things that fascinates me about his biography is that when he arrives in North America, at that point the diocesan see, the bishop's cathedral, was in San Francisco. And his very first sermon he delivers in San Francisco, he talks about this kind of message of, it's not about the hierarchy of the church. Church is all believers, and everybody has to participate in church life and things like this, which is, in Russian, the term is sobornost, sort of conciliar, right? The church is a body. It's not just a hierarchy. It's a body, and everybody has to participate. And this was very much the kind of outgrowth of, this was something that a lot of the religious philosophers were talking about from the Slavophiles onward, but he never mentions that. I don't have any evidence that he was reading those things. And he never even uses the term sobornost explicitly, at least in that early stage. So it's kind of a puzzle, where did he come to these kinds of positions? Yes. Yes. And that's part of the reason why he was elected, because he was seen as somebody who had already supported that, and therefore, there was this kind of tension in the church council. So, for those unfamiliar with Russian history, the Patriarchate, as this office that was the head of the church, had been abolished 2 centuries earlier by Peter the Great. So there had been no patriarchate patriarch for the entirety of the 19th and 20th century. The office was reinstated by this church council in 1917, the week before he was elected, right? So he was not only becoming patriarch at the time of the revolution, but he was also the first patriarch in over 200 years. And there was some concern that we'd finally found this model of involving the laity and conciliarity and so on within the church, and now we're reinstating this kind of singular authority of, the patriarch. Is that intention? And he immediately says, that he will be a patriarch who will lead through, in a conciliar way.
This might be kind of a bit of a broad question, but you mentioned how, his actions with the Soviets were kind of setting precedent for religious relationships under authoritarian rule. And while this was certainly very new, under in the Greek Orthodox Church, obviously under Ottoman rule, there was a separation of church and state, although it was different. So I was wondering if you could talk kind of about how maybe that might have been some precedent for Tikhon, or maybe how it was different circumstances and what those were.
Don't know that he ever explicitly, the Patriarch Tikhon himself ever explicitly sort of referred to that, although I do remember some early church leaders sort of, some Russian church leaders mentioning the fact that this was not the first time that the Orthodox Church was living kind of in a hostile state and potentially potential of persecution and things like that. And in fact, precisely at this time period in the early 1920s, right, the Ottoman Empire has just collapsed. The new secular Turkish state is being born, which itself was also quite hostile to the Orthodox Church. And so paradoxically, the Patriarchate of Constantinople is under almost as much threat as the Patriarch of Moscow. So there are some, I would say, interesting parallels, but also interesting differences. I mean, I use the phrase totalitarian government. The Soviets, of course, they weren't there yet in the 1920s. This was something that I think, historians debate the use of the term and all that sort of stuff, but something they aspired to and come much closer to, at least in the 1930s, especially, of this kind of complete control, not only over politics and the government, but even your cultural values and what you think about and, what you aim for in life, right? It's supposed to be guided by the government. That was certainly what they wanted. And I think that was different, let's say, than the Ottoman Empire, which created that sort of system where Christians, they existed as second-class citizens, but they were sort of a society within a society that was tolerated within those limits. So I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll afterwards transition downstairs for the reception and book signing.
Are there any additional documents or letters regarding Tikhon that you're aware of that are in Russia? And would you be able to have access to them at this time if they were there?
So I looked for and looked at everything that I knew exists. One of the things that mysteriously I have not been able to find are personal correspondence and things like this, even from before 1917. So most bishops in the Orthodox Church, they would have an archival collection where their personal papers would be in that archival collection. There is no such thing for him. And I think part of the reason for that was simply historical, that he had kept all of this stuff with him as he was a bishop and moved around. And he was in Vilnius in 1915 and had to evacuate when the Germans took the city. And so there is some very fragmentary indication that he sent boxes of his personal papers to this monastery in his home region where the abbot of the monastery was his friend and, this kind of stuff. And then there's another fragmentary reference to that monastery having been closed by the Soviets and, sort of all the stuff ransacked and papers strewn all over the basement floor and stuff. Whether those were his papers or not, we don't know. There is some reference in the secret police archive of they received some box of his personal papers that nobody ever seems to have followed up on. So the only thing that are available are what is in the secret police archive, now the FSB archive. So the church had access, or at least, I don't know how full access, but had access to that in the 1990s. And in 2000, published this massive collection, 1,000 pages of documents from the secret police archive that was all the materials that the secret police was gathering for their investigation of him, as well as the interrogation records and everything else. But supposedly, there's like 11 volumes of this secret police archive. I petitioned to be able to work in it about 10 years ago and was denied with a very flimsy excuse. So there is more there. I certainly have not been given access to it. Whether anybody else is hard to say. And anyways, Americans aren't really going to Russia to do research right now. So, yeah.
Just want to thank you, Dr. Kenworthy, for sharing the story of Patriarch Tikhon Bellavin and his fight, and the fight he led against those who sought to destroy the church and eradicate religion from early Soviet Russia. I was just reminding myself of the Baylor's mission, and to educate men and women for worldwide service and leadership. This is a great example of the rich education that we're able to provide. So thank you. We're also grateful for the Keston Lecture co-sponsors, International Studies and Departments of Religion and Modern Languages and Culture, as well as Carl Flynn and those involved in live streaming, and of course Jennifer Borderud, Rachel Bates, and the Armstrong Browning Library for hosting us in this beautiful space. Please join us downstairs in the Cox Reception Hall for a book signing by Dr. Kenworthy and refreshments. There are both stairs and an elevator available. Carl Flynn reminded me that you can get a coupon or something downstairs to get, it's a code to get 30% off of the purchase of the book. And thank you, and we'll see you downstairs.